But anyway, this morning we're talking about Native Americans in Mexican Texas, 1820 to 1835. A very complicated and dynamic and very interesting kind of subject that we're going to talk about today. And because it's so complicated and so hard to put together, particularly in 30 minutes, I'm going to narrow it down and we're going to talk about basically the immigrant Indians of Texas, the ones who came from the East and meant so much and probably were the most dynamic Indians of Texas during that period. Because things are so complicated with Texas in this period, I'm going to sum it up right here with a real short description, in that basically what was happening by about 1820 is that Spanish Texas is over and is now turning to Mexican Texas. But for the most part, it had become empty. The Spanish, the revolution and the Civil War that took place had really emptied out the Hispanic population of Texas, which was never big in the first place, but down to about 3,000 to 1,500. But not only that, disease and other factors had also reduced the Native American population. So Texas, for the most part, come 1820, was a pretty empty place relatively. Therefore, it was open to immigration from the United States from two different groups of people. One, of course, are the Anglo-American, I like to call them Protestants as well, but the people that Stephen F. Austin basically led into Texas, the immigrants who came from the United States, possibly about 5,000 to 10,000 during the 1820s, getting to about 30,000, 35,000 by 1835. But at the same time that those people were coming to Texas, another group was coming from the United States as well, and these are the Native Americans, a whole disparate group of people who came to Texas for the same reason that the Anglos did, and that is to establish land, farm. In fact, they are very much like the Anglos. They are sedentary agriculturalists. Many have learned to read and write, things like that. They also raise domesticated animals. And what they want in Texas is the same thing that the Anglo-Americans want, and that is title to their land. So basically, although we would think that these groups might clash with one another, as they were doing back in the United States at this exact time, once they got here, they actually, for a while, worked together. And that's what I want to talk about today, how they worked together. But in the end, once the Anglo-Americans got their numbers up, like in the United States, they were not about to live together and share the land with these Indians. Therefore, looking at this, I think, shows us the definite racial attitudes of the Anglo-Americans and how ultimately they pushed all the Indians westward and northward into Oklahoma and West Texas. So now let me get down to business. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here if I can with my PowerPoint. All right. Texas come 1820. Remember that the Spaniards had established Texas in the early 18th century. And basically only about 3,000 Hispanics lived in Texas in three places: San Antonio, La Bahia, or Goliad, as it's now called in Mexican Texas, and Nacogdoches. The Revolution, Civil War that took place between 1812 and 1815 had been very, very destructive to the Hispanic population of Texas and reduced it from 3,000 or so to about 1,500, most of whom lived in San Antonio and Goliad. Nacogdoches in East Texas had almost been wiped out completely, and hardly anybody lived there at all. At the same time that that happened, the natives of Texas had also been reduced dramatically as well. The Attakappans, who lived in Southeast Texas, a hunting-gathering group, their numbers had declined to less than 1,000, possibly less than 500 by this time, as had the Catawban groups of Northeastern Texas, the Tejas, the ones who Texas is named after. Those people had been the focus of Spanish Texas to some extent, but by 1820 or so, disease had really hurt them. They were down to about 1,000 people. The various groups, the Caddo-Adachos who live basically at Caddo Lake, and the Asine who live near Nacogdoches. Their numbers are down dramatically, and they really aren't the strong force anymore. Another thing that happened was that in 1816, a new round of disease hit Texas, and for the first time, this hit the Comanches. Everybody thinks about, when you think about Indians of Texas, we think of the Comanches, but they were hurt very harshly in this 1816, I think it's a smallpox epidemic. And not that they were in retreat, or not that their power was lessened, but I'm going to leave them for later, and you guys can ask me questions about them. For the Comancheria, they were in charge of that, which is basically west of I-35 or west of US 281, I like to say. But for the most part, that's Comancheria, that's their territory. They are not really involved in what's going on for the most part here in East Texas. So I'm talking about, when we're talking about Texas, east of I-35 and even farther east than that for the most part. The Comanches, they did make peace with Mexico. The Comanches and the Lipan Apaches sent representatives down to Mexico City. They signed papers. And basically what the Mexican government did was what the Spanish government did was pay the Comanches off, give them presents, give them trading rights, things like that. And for the most part, the Comanches will stay to the west and not really be involved in the events that are going to take place here. Therefore, much of East Texas was wide open. The other groups of Texas, that's Indian groups that did exist and were still factors, were the Karankawas along the coasts, those hunters and gatherers who lived right in the middle of Austin's colony. Again, their numbers were down as well. Also, the Tonkawas, who live about 100 miles from the coast, but in the center of Austin's colony. They exist, but they're sort of weak as well. The one formidable group that did exist, still exists, our native group, are the Wichitas. The Wichitas who live basically along I-35. They are fellow Caddoans like the Caddos. They are sedentary farmers. And the Wichitan groups, who are very important and basically the strongest remaining native Indians in East Texas at this point, are the Wacos and the Tawakanese, who live in the Brazos Valley, farming in big villages. The Wacos, of course, live at Waco, and the Tawakanese live in various villages nearby. These guys only live about 100, 150 miles away from Austin's colony, and Austin saw them as a threat. They are the conduit to the Comanches, and from their villages, occasionally they will be raiding and back and forth. But we will see that the immigrant Americans and the immigrant Indians really focus their hostilities against the Wacos and Tawakanese, and ultimately move them out of Texas for the most part by 1835. Therefore, let's get to our immigrant Indians. We have two groups of immigrant Indians who come. One group that comes from, that enters Southeastern Texas, and they actually did this before Mexican Texas. They did this after the Louisiana Purchase. And they consist of tribes who are, once again, all agricultural, sedentary people. And ultimately, they come under the rubric of the Alabamas and the Coushatas. On the other hand, the tribes that go, and they all come from the Southeast. They are all Muskogean speakers. They are all agricultural, so I'll get into them in a little bit more detail in a minute. The other group that comes to Northeastern Texas, most of them come from the northern part of the United States, like the Shawnees, Delawares, and Kickapoos. But the leading group, and the leading group of all these people, to some extent, will be the Cherokees. The Cherokees, who, of course, come from the Southeast. All of these tribes, and this is the real stress, is that all these tribes had been in contact with Europeans for at least 100 years, if not 200 years. And they had sort of picked and chosen the best parts of European culture and discarded the rest. All of them were naturally farmers, but they had picked up metal farming utensils to increase their output. They increased more crops and things like that. But the most important thing they did that Europeans introduced to them was that they were pastoralists. They raised cattle, they raised horses, they raised pigs, and for the most part, they are pretty similar to your average Anglo-American Protestant who comes to Texas in the 1820s and 1830s. In fact, our Appalachians are Christians. So let's look at those guys first, and then we'll see where they came from. Hopefully everybody's following me, as this is weird just to be talking to myself, but I assume you're all listening out there. But the groups that end up in Southeastern Texas down here are groups that were initially allied with the Spaniards and the French prior to 1763. One of the groups are called the Appalachians. They live, at which the Appalachian Mountains are named after. They are a Mississippian group who originally lived around Tallahassee, Florida, and they accepted Spanish missions into their territory as early as 1630. Therefore, these guys became Catholics and maintained their Christianity as they will move westward into Louisiana and then into Texas. In 1700 or so, the French came and settled first at Mobile here, and they allied themselves with local Indians such as the Biloxis, the Pascagoulas, the Mobiles, and then farther upstream, the Alabamas and the Coushatas, who we would consider as part of the Creek Confederacy. All of these groups speak a similar language, which is Muskogean. All of them are farmers, the Appalachians particularly successful, and all of them, after the destruction of Spanish Florida by the British in 1700, all of them gathered around the French and were allies with them near Mobile. There they picked up the customs, clothing, metal goods, other kinds of things from the Europeans, and like I said, the Appalachians maintained their Christianity. We have a picture of an Appalachia right here. This is what they look like. And after 1763, these guys started to migrate westward. 1763, of course, the British took control of everything east of the Mississippi River. France abandoned North America. And these tribes, not wanting to deal with the British, who they thought were anti-Indian and and had enslaved many of their people and things like that in the early period, beginning in 1763, they asked permission of the Spanish government, who were in charge of Louisiana at the time, if they could move west of the Mississippi River and settle there. So all of them then, between 1763 and about 1775 or so, moved into this area in the center of Louisiana near Alexandria, where the Spaniards allowed them to set up villages, farm, raise their animals, do all that kind of stuff, hunt. And as well, the Appalachians continued to maintain their religion, and they would travel to Natchitoches to have their children baptized, and they had weddings there under the auspices of the Catholic Church. So these guys are Spanish allies and very good Spanish citizens of Spain. And this is another thing to put forth, is that Spain and Mexico assumed that the Indians were citizens of their country just as the Europeans. This will be in direct contrast to the Anglo-Americans. So those guys were there in central Louisiana, and then the Louisiana Purchase occurred in 1803, of course, and immediately they said, we do not want anything to do with these Anglo-Americans. They are hostile to our interests, and therefore, beginning in 1804, they asked permission from the Spanish governors of Texas if they could cross into southeastern Texas. The Spanish governor inquired about them, found that they were industrious, hardworking agriculturalists. Some were Christian, things like that, and therefore allowed them to move westward between 1804 and 1815 or so into this period, into this area here in southeastern Texas, basically between the lower Trinity and the Neches River, pretty much unoccupied due to the disappearance of the Attakapan groups there. This is that so-called big thicket of Texas, that area down there. And to a large extent, they were left alone during this period and established villages. And ultimately, they will come under they'll intermarry with one another as their population declines. And they will be that group that's known as the Alabamas and the Coushatas. I would ask, has anybody got a question right now, but don't have that ability, so we will continue on. Our other group.
Hey, Todd, do you mind running the clicking it into a slideshow so we can see the maps a little larger?
Okay, yeah. There we go.
I'm sorry you had to lose your spot, but I think it'll be helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Our other group that's going to settle in northeastern Texas, most of them come from the northern part of the United States, north of the Ohio River. And these are our Delawares, who were originally from New Jersey and Pennsylvania along the Delaware River. The Shawnees, who live in Ohio or so, and our Kickapoos. All of these groups are Algonquian speakers. They have a similar culture. They are, once again, farmers originally. They adopted livestock raising and things like that. And for the most part, they felt the British, English, American settlers to being antipathetic to their ideas and wanted their land. So they will basically fight with the Americans after 1783, lose many of these battles. And eventually by 1790s, the Delawares and the Shawnees and the Kickapoos will start their process of moving west, just like our Southeastern Indians, moving to Spanish Louisiana in the 1790s, Spanish Louisiana in Missouri in the 1790s or so, where the Spaniards accepted them and was very supportive of them. Here is our Lenape Delaware. The Delawares are originally called the Lenni Lenapes, who ended up here and then came into northeastern Texas. Our other group, and these are the most important ones, are the Cherokees, who come from the Cherokee territory here. As with all these Indians, they clash with the English and then the Americans. Most of the Cherokees remain in their homelands until their forced removal in 1835 or so. But some who wanted no part of the United States, like the others, had abandoned the United States and moved west of the Mississippi River into Arkansas after 1803, and then moved in, and all these groups then moved into, the northern groups moved into northeastern Texas between 1815 and 1825 or so, settling for the most part around Nacogdoches. The Cherokees, unlike the Algonquian-speaking Delawares and Shawnees and Kickapoos, they are Iroquoian speakers. They are agriculturalists, they are pastoralists as well. So they all share the same culture, they just share different languages and stuff like that. One of the keys about the Cherokees, and which makes them so important, is that they have learned to, many of them have learned to read and write. And this is going to give the edge of all the others. And because of this, they will assume the leadership of most of these groups due to their ability to read and write. The Cherokees are led by a chief by the name of Duwali. The Cherokees have two chiefs, a civil chief and a war chief, a diplomatic chief. Duwali, or Chief Bowl, is known as the civil chief, the main chief. He's also called Chief Bowl. But they have a second chief, a diplomatic chief, and this guy's name is Richard Fields. He is 1/8 Cherokee. He knows how to read and write. He knows how to read and write Spanish and French and English. So he will be the conduit to all that goes on here as we move along. So these guys come into Texas about 1820 or so. And the one thing that they want is to escape from the Anglo-Americans who are hot on their tail. Another thing I want to point out is that after 1815 and the defeat of the English at the War of 1812, the weakness of the Spaniards in Florida, it's at this point that the Anglo-American Protestants really spread across the Trans-Appalachian West. This is called the Great Migration. They flood into Alabama, Mississippi. Both of those places become states. They flood into Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. Those places become states. And after 1815, the pressure to remove the Native Americans from that area becomes very, very intense. So these Indians are trying to escape that at the same time that at the western extension of this Anglo-American westward movement is the settlers who come to Texas. So they all come about the same time, and both groups, the Anglo-Americans and the immigrant Indians of Texas, what they want is title to their lands, recognition from the Mexican government that they have the right to settle in Texas and begin their agricultural practices. As a result of, so they're very similar to the Anglos. The only thing different from them is that they do not have slaves and they're not involved in commercial agriculture. This is going to be a big difference, but that is a difference. And rather than coexist with these Indians, the Anglos are going to drive them out. But at this point, they don't have the numbers to do that. And for the most part, they will ally themselves with these groups. So the first thing I want to point out is that as Stephen F. Austin settled around the mouths of the Brazos and the Colorado River and noted that the governments had changed from Spanish to Mexican, he went down to Mexico City and stayed there for a while to make sure that his impresarial contract was recognized by the Mexican government. The same thing happened with the immigrant Indians. Richard Fields, the diplomatic chief of the Cherokees, went to San Antonio in 1821 and 1822, met with the now Mexican governor of San Antonio, a guy by the name of Tres Palacios, and he received permission from him to settle in East Texas. Fields then claimed that he spoke for all the bands of East Texas, the Cherokees and their associated bands. Now, many of the associated bands hadn't agreed to this, but they were willing to go along with this. And mainly the associated bands include all the Indians that I've talked about who came from the East, not only the ones near Nacogdoches, but the ones in the Southeast down here. So this is the Fields-Tres Palacios Agreement of 1822. And unlike Stephen F. Austin, Richard Fields did go to Mexico City, but did not gain permission from the Mexican government, which was moving from the empire of Iturbide to the Constitution. So therefore he didn't get the necessary paperwork. So they went ahead with this Fields-Tres Palacios Agreement as a sign that the Indians had the right to settle in East Texas. So they get there 1822, 1823, everybody's settling down. Austin's dealing as well. The old 300 are settling. And at the same time, the Spaniards established other impresarial agreements in East Texas. A place like Nacogdoches becomes a very multinational place as a few thousand Anglo-Americans move in, along with hundreds or so of Hispanics that are there, Mexicans who are there, as well as all these new Indians, along with the Caddo Indians and the Attakapas who are already there, along with a bunch of French Catholics from Natchitoches, who have moved into East Texas. So unlike what we think of Nacogdoches later on, where it's pretty much a black-white continuum dichotomy, here in the 1820s, it's really this multinational kind of place. And at this point, there really isn't that much conflict. In 1826, things start to happen, however, and this is that Fredonian Rebellion, where a group of Americans try to separate themselves from Mexico and establish their own government and state of Fredonia. And this puts the Cherokees in a tight spot. For the Hayden Edwards, the head of the Fredonian Rebellion, makes an offer to Richard Fields that if he backs the Americans in this rebellion, the Fredonians will grant them all the land north of Nacogdoches, from Nacogdoches to the Red River for the most part, to these Indians. The Cherokees are, do we do this or do we not do this? Who's really in power here? Richard Fields chose to side with the Fredonians, whereas Stephen F. Austin and others convinced Chief Duwally or Chief Bowl to remain within Mexican Texas, and therefore the Cherokees did not side with the Fredonians. The rebellion was put down easily, and the Cherokees then executed Richard Fields for his supposedly treasonous activity. So at this point, as we see, the Cherokees and the Anglos, led by Stephen F. Austin, are pretty much together, and at least working together at this point. And in fact, both of them, at the encouragement of Stephen F. Austin, have decided that the Wacos and Tawakanese are the enemies that need to really be wiped out in Texas. So Stephen F. Austin begins to encourage the Cherokees, who are warlike to some extent, and the others, to go against the Wacos and Tawakanese in central Texas. The Fredonian Rebellion then leads to the expedition of General Mier y Terán, who comes to East Texas to survey the situation. And of course, he is alarmed by the numbers of Anglo-Americans who he can tell don't really have no ties to Mexican Texas. And if we let them all come in even further, Texas will be swallowed up by the United States. He also meets with all these groups, notes their industriousness, their agricultural inclinations, their pastoral nature, the fact that many of them can read and write, some of them are Christians, things like that. Therefore, he puts forth the idea, which is encapsulated in the law of April 6, 1830, of course, that we need to stop immigration from the United States and support these Indian immigrants from the United States and really establish their land grants, things like that, keep them from there, and hopefully these Indians can be a buffer to against the American immigration that is continuing to come on, and in fact increases as we move along here in the 1830s. As he puts forth his ideas, like with the April 6, 1830 deal, the Cherokees and others meet with Austin and meet with Mier y Terán, and all of them decide that the one thing they need to do is to move the Wacos and Tawakanese out of Texas. And therefore, Mier y Terán and Stephen Austin encourage these groups to make war upon the Wacos and Tawakanese. So beginning in 1830, the Cherokees, then followed by the Shawnees and Delawares, and then Alabama's Coushatta's, they all begin to make raids and attack the Waco and Tawakanee villages in the Brazos and Navasota valleys, assisted by Mexican soldiers, therefore, and Anglo Rangers. And ultimately, burn the great Waco village at Waco in 1830, 1831, and just sweep all these Indians out of Central Texas by 1835. As this happens, Teran, who is in charge of the immigration, he puts forth the order in 1831 that the governor of Coahuila, Tejas, a guy by the name of Jose Maria Letona, that he should go ahead and start to survey the lands for the Cherokees and the Indians of Northeastern Texas, as well as the Alabama Cushatas of Southeastern Texas. And so this starts to go forth in 1831, 1832. Surveyors go out, look at their lands, they start to make their marks and stuff like that. But a few things then happen. General Teran, who is their biggest supporter, he commits suicide because he cannot stop the flow from the United States. Governor Letona, who is involved in this, he dies of yellow fever and is replaced by somebody else who's not that interested in it. And therefore, this land grants and surveying stalls by 1832. In 1833, the Cherokees, Chief Bull Duale, goes to San Antonio and then on to Monclova, meets with the new governor of Coahuila, Texas, a guy by the name of Beramende, and says, we need our lands to be surveyed, we need them to be certified, things like that. And Governor Beramende says that, well, your lands overlap with some impresario contracts, so I can't do anything, but you guys do have the right to stay on your land. And the Cherokees, again, speaking for their associated bands, goes ahead and agrees to that. Not happy, but they agree to that. And then come 1835, as things start to heat up between the American colonists and the Mexican government, now the Cherokees and their associated bands start to see their chance. Both sides, the Americans and the Mexicans, want at least the Indians to be neutral in this upcoming war. And the Cherokees have to make this decision. Who, like they did back in 1826, who has power in Texas? Is the Mexican government in power or the Anglos in power? Which one should we side with? Therefore, with the Americans basically being more present, as the Americans formed the consultation in the late 1835, they send out Sam Houston, who is familiar with the Cherokees back east and is a friend of Chief Bull. And he, on February 23rd, that's 1836 there, signs a treaty with the revolutionaries, signs a treaty with the Cherokees and their associated bands, all the Indians of East Texas, granting them a reservation, which basically is Cherokee County here in Texas today, the lands between the Natchez and Angelina up to the Sabine. Originally, the Cherokees had wanted all the way to the Trinity, but they went ahead and gave in to this, and therefore, they secured this land. Again, note that this took place on February 23rd, 1836. A few weeks later, the Texans met, declared independence, got in the business of writing a constitution, but they did not go ahead and ratify this treaty. They did not grant the land to the Cherokees. During the invasion of Santa Ana and all that, the Cherokees stood by watching closely what to do, but they didn't do anything during the war. And then with the great victory at San Jacinto by the Americans, pretty much this neutralized the Cherokee position. With all these Anglo-Americans now flooding into Texas at this point, very clearly the position of the Anglos became anti-Indian, like they had been in the Southeast, and ultimately the treaty was rejected in 1837 by the Texas Senate, despite its support by President Houston. And then when Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar became president in 1838, and remember he's from Georgia, the same place that is at this exact moment in 1838 kicking the Cherokees out of Georgia. He wants the Cherokees and all Indians removed from East Texas, and under his presidency, this takes place. And in 1839, 1840, the Texans forcibly remove the Cherokees and all these allies from Texas, and they're forced to move to Oklahoma with their kinsmen. The only Indians who are allowed to remain are a few hundred Alabama Cushatas who live in the big thicket. Nobody's really there, and that's that. So that is a quick overview of the immigrant Indians. They come here with the same ideas as the Anglo-Protestants. The Anglo-Protestants, Americans side with them when they need them, but ultimately, I think the idea is that these Anglos, mainly from the South, they're doing the same things in the American South, Indian Removal Act of 1830 and such. Ultimately, the same ideas, the same patterns emerge with these same immigrant Indians in Texas. And by 1840, there are very few Indians east of I-35. And it's at that point that the Comanches become very important. I guess I'll stop there and take questions.